Set rotation does not stop vintage formats from taking on an ever-changing and adapting state. As players return to these older formats with a more competitive eye, top-tier, ultra-refined deck lists emerge, and today we are talking about one deck list in particular that caught my eye as being potentially my favorite I've seen from Base Fossil in a very long time. Throughout all the videos in this playlist, we have talked the individual cards to death. It's mainly just how they interact in a unique way for this deck in particular, so the best way to discuss it is by jumping directly into the deck list itself. Probably no surprise here, but this deck includes a full playset of the best Pokemon in format, Big Licky. This build is all about accomplishing multiple things at once, and Lickitung does that. It's a damage sponge, it's a stall Pokemon because Tongue Wrap does have that 50% chance of paralyzing, while also dealing chip damage and resisting Mewtwo. Just an all-around fantastic card to have in any list. Next up is Fossil Psyduck, whose Headache attack for 1 Psychic Energy can stop your opponent from playing trainer cards on their next turn, completely stalling out their setup. For a format so heavily reliant on trainers for setup, this Psyduck is a bomb. Next on the list is Fossil Moltres. Wildfire, for however many energy you have attached, you can discard that many fire energy and mill that many cards from the top of your opponent's deck. Typically, when you're playing Moltres, you want your opponent to be playing lots of trainers and thinning their own deck, but in this case, it's more about control. It's keeping everything you want and denying your opponent of everything that they want. So a Moltres is basically gonna sit on your bench and just gather spare fire energy as you go through your gameplay, and then once you've accumulated enough to win, you just swap it in there and mill your opponent to death. A couple copies of Mew for punishing your opponent for playing a lot of energy onto their Pokemon in something like Rain Dance, but also Devolution Beam, so that if your opponent has a Venusaur with 8 damage counters on it, you can just devolve it and knock out the Ivysaur. One copy of Mewtwo to recycle energy from your discard using energy absorption, and also deal with other psychic types like Alakazam and opposing Mewtwo for the rare scenario where you do have to go a bit aggro. And then finally, one copy of Scyther just as an energy sponge, utilizing that free retreat to just absorb some energy. Every now and then you might attack with it, but you're not exactly going to be hitting a ton of Pokemon for weakness. The draw power in this deck is going to be coming from 3 copies of Professor Oak and 1 copy of Gambler, a card that you really only ever see in Moltres Wildfire decks, because either option is kind of good for you. On one hand, you're drawing 8 cards, which fills your hand with resources. On the other hand, you're only drawing 1 card after shuffling in your hand, which also prevents you from decking out before your opponent. But the weight of those 2 options really only comes into play when one of the win conditions for your deck is decking out your opponent. Since part of that win condition, and a win condition on its own, is depriving your opponent of resources, we're going all in on energy removal. Full play set of energy removal and super energy removal. On top of Psyduck making the trainers in their hand useless, the other very annoying part of this deck that you're going to be doing to your opponent is making sure that any energy card they attach to their Pokemon is just getting discarded right away, and that they are not able to build up to any super powerful attacks. Because you're going to be discarding a lot of energy with super energy removal as well as Moltres Wildfire attack, we got a full playset of energy retrieval in here, so that if you really need to, if you get in a position where you have to fire off Moltres earlier than you would really want to, just to try to get a lot of resources out of your opponent's deck and into the discard, you have an option to get those back with energy retrieval. Now, another thing you're going to be depriving your opponent of is taking prizes if they are able to get off a bunch of consecutive smaller attacks that you just don't have enough energy removals to completely stop them from putting damage counters on you. Well, there's 4 copies of Scoop Up, 2 copies of Mr. Fuji, and 3 copies of Pokemon Center that can kind of be used interchangeably to get Pokemon out of range of knockout, depending on the scenario. So if the Pokemon's on your bench, you can use Mr. Fuji. If the Pokemon no longer has any energy attached to it, so if you just use a Wildfire off of a Moltres, it has no energy on it, but it does have some damage counters, you can Pokemon Center it. There's not going to be a downside, and you may have already noticed every Pokemon in this deck is a basic. So you don't have to waste any time evolving up, building up to attacks. It's really just jump straight in and start controlling your opponent's side of the field while you just kind of set up your own in the background, building up towards multiple win conditions at once. Whether it's decking them out through either Wildfire or by straight up stall, or just overwhelming them with attacks while depriving them of the ability to attack on their own. Last may seem a little bit counterproductive to the Wildfire strategy until you realize that Psyduck can make your opponent have to hang on to a ton of trainers in their hand. When you hit them with Last, all of those trainers are going back into their deck, and then next turn you can Wildfire and just send a ton of those trainers straight into discard. So yes, you are filling their deck with more resources, just a number of cards that are going to keep them from decking out, but you're really depriving them of those resources forever. You know, they're going to run out of item finders by sending those cards into the deck and then milling the deck. And that's why I keep saying this deck is doing a lot of different things at once that all complement one another. So the goal of the deck isn't strictly to mill your opponent. The goal of the deck is control and to deprive your opponent of resources from knockouts any way possible. Another aspect of this build that I love is its matchups. It's Aerodactyl proof, it's muck proof. The only form of disruption it really cares about is opposing Psyducks trainer locking you first. When it comes to a mirror match with this deck, sometimes it does come down to who used Headache first and who had a better opening hand to back up that Psyduck without having to rely on trainers. You can probably tell by looking at the deck list and just from the way I've been talking about it, but this does require a bit higher level of player skill. Reading the field, managing your own resources, anticipating what your opponent's resources are, and playing counter to their primary strategy as it changes. Like any form of control deck, it's not very fun to play against, but I do find it super interesting whenever players are able to synthesize this type of deck out of a format, especially vintage formats. I'm not a control player. I think it's a little too cerebral for me. I like stompy decks that's just load down a Pokemon and do a big attack. I'm the same way in Magic. I prefer big creatures. And combos, I don't like control decks, but I did want to share this list to the channel just because I saw a similar build posted online. I saw the idea posted, I built it, made some adjustments, play tested it for myself, and was just like, wow, this has to be close to the pinnacle of what base Fossil can do. Super high win percentages, meaning that going into best 2 out of 3, you're almost always going to come out on top. Relatively fast for a control deck, which is kind of rare, but also fits within the standard play parameters of base Fossil, which is hit the ground running, get your strategy moving as quickly as possible, turn 1, turn 2, or you lose. I don't have much more to say about this deck, so I want to hear from you guys. What are your thoughts? How do you feel about this build? Are you in agreement with me that this seems to be close to the best we can get within base Fossil? Is this the pinnacle? Are you a fan of control? Are there any cards in this list that you were surprised to see? Let me know down in the comments. Let's keep the discussion going. Thank you so much for watching. If you want more vintage Pokemon TCG content, stay tuned to the channel. Social media links in the description. I'll see you next video.